Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a few moments until we have attendees sign on, and we'll start momentarily. Thank you. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are just waiting just a few moments while people sign on. You are present at the Checked webinar series hosted by Mitek Systems, and we'll be with you just momentarily. Great. So welcome, everybody. My name is Cindy White. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Mitek Systems, and it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting the first in a quarterly series of webinars, Checked. And these webinars are focused on the banking industry, fraud and financial crimes within the banking industry. And we'll be hosting some of the thought leaders joining us today. Dr. David Maimon. David, it is my absolute pleasure to have you join us. We're going to get started right away. You have an impressive background in criminology centered around financial services, and many of us have had the opportunity to read your work, hear you speak on the topic. But without further ado, if you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes to introduce yourself.
Sure. So thank you so much, first of all, for having me in your first seminar. I mean, it looks like it'll be a very successful series. So, good luck in the future on this one as well. So, yeah, I mean, David Maimon, I'm a professor in Georgia State University. I'm also the director of the Evidence-Based Cybersecurity Research Group in campus. And my work focuses on trying to understand what works and what doesn't in the context of cybersecurity, and also in the context of online fraud. That is what it keeps me running, sort of speaking.
And keeps you running. Did you always know that this was curious for you, or how did you get into this specific niche? And what keeps you motivated to stay in it?
It's a great question. No, I mean, I didn't want to do that, right? In the past. So my academic journey is kind of, interesting because when my PhD is in sociology, and when I was pursuing that degree, my area of interest was really neighborhood effects, right? I mean, I was really interested in understanding how the neighborhood you live in impacts your deviant outcome. So, I was back then when I was in Ohio State, I sat in front of a computer with many surveys and questionnaires other people used to sort of collect data and run analysis, trying to find correlations, right, and relationships between neighborhood characteristics and folks' deviant outcomes, including things like suicide and violent behavior and property offending. But when I graduated, I didn't want to do that anymore. It was boring to me, and I told my wife that I just I don't want to do that. I mean, I want to do something different. And back then I was reading a lot about the giant squid. I don't know if folks are familiar with this beast, but it lives in the deep, and it's a humongous beast. And back then, it was 2009. We didn't have any images, either in photo or videos of that creature. And so I got into my mind that I'm going to be the one who will video that beast, right? I wanted to be in a submarine, right, and just dive the ocean, right, and look at the deeps and try to investigate and find that huge beast. But yeah, my wife didn't want to be poor for 4 years. So she told me, no, you can do that, but just without me. And so she told me I have to provide now after she provided for so long. So I had to find a way to provide for the family, but still keep things going and keep things interesting for me. So I looked around. There were some people doing cybercrime research. It wasn't great, and I thought to myself, this is probably a niche I could sort of dive deeper, so to speak, and create some interesting, valuable, significant research insights in. And that's how I got into working on cybercrime and focus on online fraud.
It's a wonderful story, a very sticky one. I will not forget the giant squid or the deeps. You went from one dark, deep dark to another deep dark, which is the dark web, right? And you've done a bunch of research on evidence-based cybersecurity. Is that where it started, or is that your most recent piece in terms of relevance to the world we live in today?
So it really started with my fascination with hackers, right? I mean, this is what I wanted to do at the time. I mean, and I actually did that. I mean, we published a lot in the context of hacking, but the research we published at the time and the research we engaged in at the time was really innovative, because what we've done was we deployed honeypots. This was 2010, 2011, and we allowed hackers to take over the honeypots, and then they took over, right, without knowing that they participate in a scientific research. And then we simply started playing with them. We started nudging them to behave on the system. The thought process back then was that, if we nudge them to behave, we may be able to detect them on the system in a more rapid manner than we are right now. So we were doing this for a long period of time, and it was fun, right? Because again, it's like being in the deep. Nobody was doing that at the time. And then Georgia State reached out, and because they read a lot about the research, they read a lot about the approach we were developing, the evidence-based approach, and they told me, come here to Atlanta and just, we're going to give you resources to do what you want. You're going to have your own group. Just do it here, right? And here in Atlanta, we have the fintech industry and a lot of opportunities. Plus, I mean, what they promised me here in Georgia State was just great. So we moved in, and when we moved in 4.5 years ago, I was able to expand the operation. So from just focusing on hackers and Wi-Fi network, we did a lot of work on Wi-Fi as well. I suddenly had a group of people who were very much curious and interested in understanding all aspects of cybercrime, right? I mean, so that is where we started diving in more and more in the darknet and studying online fraud more, simply because we have the manpower, which allowed us to go on those locations, go on those places, collect data in a systematic manner, and then create insights of everything that we're seeing, right? I mean, so we started with the hackers, and when I moved in like 5 years ago to Georgia State, we started this operation, embedded ourselves on the darknet, have multiple fake identities, sock puppets out there. We of course follow the criminals because we really have no agenda, right, with respect to what to study. I mean, we study what we are interested in, and curiosity is what drives it all. But because there's a lot going on right now on this ecosystem, we're there, right? And we've been there, and I think we're going to continue to be there for a long period of time. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of like being in the deeps, right? Because everywhere we look, on a daily basis, sometimes you find new beast, new animal, right? I mean, new type of fraud that folks are working on, new types of evidence you can collect in order to try and make sense about the modus operandi. And that's what the group does, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the evidence-based cybersecurity research group try to understand what works and what doesn't in the context of cybersecurity tools as well as online fraud prevention, and being out there help us do that.
And I think we are, as an ecosystem, so grateful that we have you and the teams that work around you to help us with that, because it does feel like a never-ending pit of insights that we have to gather. Do you ever get to a point where you feel like you're just getting ahead of them, and then it takes a sharp direction that they might have cottoned on, that you were catching up to them?
Getting ahead of them, in what sense? That's interesting, right? I mean, what do you have in
Yeah, so
mind?
I always think about, even if us doing this webinar, like they're probably doing research on us, like we're doing research on them. So do you believe these large environments of or syndicated fraudsters are ever one step ahead of us, or are we one step ahead of them in terms of the insights that we're gathering?
So it's a great question, right? I mean, in terms of insights, we always will be a step, like 4 steps behind these guys, right?
Mhm.
I think that if you're in the ecosystem and you do what I do, you can be maybe 1 step behind them. Unfortunately, I think that in the context of the industry and the way things are in the industry, we're doomed to be like 4, maybe even 5 steps behind, and that is because folks are not spending time in the ecosystem. I mean, you mentioned this word ecosystem. It's an amazing, important word that we need to start embracing in the context of fraud prevention. It's an ecosystem. So and within the ecosystem, you have so many actors, right? I mean, you have the fraudsters, of course. You have the folks who enable them to engage in online fraud. You have the targets, and then we have the companies and law enforcement, right? Who are all trying to sort of make sure that we do not fall victims to online fraud. So the ecosystem rapidly changes, right? I mean, it's like a biological ecosystem, and unfortunately, the way we do fraud prevention nowadays, right? I mean, is more focused on building castles, right, around our organizations, right, around our FIs, and I think what needs to be done in order to be a step behind the fraudsters and not 4 is being out there and really embed yourself in the ecosystem. Talk to the bad guys or the fraudsters. I don't know if they're bad, but they're fraudsters. Talk to them, understand the ecosystem, understand what folks are working on, talk to victims, then potentially, and doing it in a systematic manner, right? I mean, once you do it in a systematic manner, then you'll be able to identify emerging trends, what folks are working on right now, and whether they're successful in it or not, right? And if you see signs of success, then you can immediately jump and try and prevent, right? The problem is that we're not there, and we see some, well, we see signs of success as scholars. We talk about that, but folks who are behind sort of the targets begin to see that when it's too late. And so that's why I keep saying, I mean, what we see in the ecosystem potentially allows us to be a step behind them. What the industry is seeing is usually like 4 steps behind. So exploration to me is the most important thing that fraud fighter could bring into their efforts to prevent fraud.
Exploration, and as you said, consistency, systematically, intentionally going after it. I'm not sure if it's a trend or if it's long been just one of those areas of softness, but you talk about dropped bank accounts or drop accounts. Tell us a little bit about what that is and how banks and other financial institutions can defend against that.
So the drop bank accounts is one of those trends we were able to identify in the end of 2022. Folks were working on. So the criminals, the drop bank accounts are essentially bank accounts the criminals open under fictitious identities, and then they use those accounts to either deposit checks, stolen checks, forged checks, sometimes even legit checks, and then also transfer money from one account to another, right, in order to either launder money or use the money to sponsor their other illicit operations. These are what drops accounts all about, and drop accounts have been around for a while now. It's the fact that we started seeing them in late 2022 doesn't mean that that this phenomena just started back then. But what is new is the magnitude of this issue, right? I mean, the fact that there's a need for them. There's the need for drop accounts is high right now in the ecosystem. So we see more and more vendors, more and more criminals offering those services of opening those drop bank accounts, because I will say, starting 2021, we see some kind of a disruption on the ecosystem, the fraud ecosystem. More checks, a lot of checks coming in, and there's a need for drop accounts which will allow you to deposit those stolen checks and then withdraw the money, right? I mean, so the need kind of drove the activity, the supply, right? And so we're seeing more and more of those. We're seeing this in the form of individual bank accounts. We're seeing this, unfortunately, in the context of business bank accounts. The criminals simply open those bank accounts, and they use those accounts to either steal money from the bank, steal money from victims, or in some cases, many cases, I would even say, launder money.
Yeah, I was going to say, it feels like a great example of, or a great system in which to wash their money. But you spoke a little bit about the checks. So yes, there's many ways to get the money into the bank account, but one of the ways, clearly a check, you brought it up, deposit the check, forge the check, do whatever with the check. We feel it ourselves, the rise in check fraud. Can you talk just a little bit about the role of checks in this dark environment?
So yeah, I mean, checks and the presence of stolen checks in the environment, I think, completely disrupted the homeostasis we had in the fraud ecosystem prior to 2021. I mean, in mid 2021, check fraud still existed, but to a very low levels. I mean, nobody really gave attention to check fraud because there wasn't too much of it. And in 2021, mid 2021, something happened in the ecosystem, and that is we started to see more and more stolen checks filtering through, and the volume of stolen checks we were able to observe, again in a systematic manner, was just crazy, right? I mean, so because we were documenting the volume of checks on the ecosystem in a systematic manner starting 2020, we had some points of comparison. So I can tell you that in October 2020, for example, in a single week where we collected data, we found around 114 checks on the ecosystem. And again, we're talking about the ecosystem. I mean, in this specific project, we focused on 60 markets only, 60 online fraud markets. But then a year after, we were talking about more than 1,500 checks a month. Nowadays, we're talking about close to 3,000 checks every month. So the influx of checks to the ecosystem, as well as the information that was available on the ecosystem, in the information from the checks, as well as the fact that the platforms on which those checks were posted were really easy to use and allowed folks to engage quite rapidly with each other, in my mind, completely disrupted the ecosystem the way we knew it. Because in 1 minute, sort of speaking, you started to have so many checks you could cash, and then so many identities you can use. And of course, so many bank accounts and routing numbers you can use when you start cooking checks, that it completely disrupted the way we were doing fraud prevention, right? I mean, so when we started talking about it in 2021, in the beginning of 2022, I got a lot of pushback from people saying check fraud is gone. I mean, you shouldn't be worried about check fraud. I mean, we're not losing money from check fraud. But then I was showing folks numbers saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I've just seen today. This is what I've seen last month in terms of checks, in terms of the raw sort of data I'm looking at. And people still didn't believe. Not now, we know that it's a completely different story. Right now, check fraud is one of the major things, major type of fraud banks and financial institutions are dealing with, right? So
it's almost as if they, the fraudsters are looking for the Achilles heel in any sort of environment. So as consumer behavior shifts, we might find that, you know, sophistication and technology has stopped them in certain areas. And we had, to your point, taken our eye off the ball relative to check fraud, and they've circled back around and starting to target this.
it's a combination, right? I mean, it's a combination of where the checks essentially came from. I mean, the fact that these guys had an opportunity, and all those checks are coming from USPS mailboxes. I mean, everybody knows that at this point. And we keep posting about this. We see all the stolen arrow keys. We see all the robberies that mail carriers are experiencing in this country during the last 3 years or so. So the checks come directly from USPS mailboxes, and then their organized crime groups are dealing with those checks. And now we are familiar with a very detailed illicit supply chain, which allows a very thorough, very detailed processing of those checks, right? I mean, and the information on the check. So and that, yeah, that goes directly with the vulnerability that financial institutions are experiencing in the context of check fraud detection. So it's a combination of things. But the reason why I keep saying that the check theft in this country disrupted the homeostasis of the ecosystem is that, you know, check fraud is just one type of fraud we're dealing with right now. I mean, we're dealing with drop bank accounts. We will be dealing a lot with, you know, identity theft, and you know, the application of the continuous application of benefits from the government. Folks are now establishing bank accounts and with companies' name, with fictitious companies' name, and those names will be used to apply for SBA loans. So it's like the ecosystem completely gotten crazy because there's this intruder, right? I mean, a lot of checks, there's an influx of checks, and now you can just take the information from the check and use it to any type of fraud that your mind desire.
Absolutely. And I think the perfect storm, when you think about just the physical theft of a check and how much information is available on that check for the fraudster to manipulate. So from a check, the data that's available to, you know, create a synthetic identity, either for a business or for a human. And as this ecosystem, we have accountability to protect the consumer. At least if we can't protect the consumer, advise and inform the consumer of some of the risks that they have and how they can leverage it. What are some of the, you know, the best practices that you've seen within the financial services, particularly banks, in terms of helping to combat some of these frauds, particularly check fraud?
Well, I mean, I know that banks are doing their best in order to prevent this issue. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about it, the banks are the victims of this type of crime as well. I mean, in my mind, they're not less victim than the individual or the businesses their checks are being stolen from. You know, what we see is financial institutions getting more and more into the realm of understanding where the checks are coming from and trying to collect checks from those platforms, their own checks, of course. They don't want to collect checks belonging to other financial institutions. So we see that happens. We see an increased interest in developing tools that will allow the banks to actually detect stolen and fraudulent checks. But you know, it's really a challenge, right? Because with the technology that the criminals have nowadays, it's fairly easy to cook a check, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we first started talking about this issue, we were talking about check washing, which essentially means, you know, you take the stolen checks, you soak them in nail polish remover or acetone or any other relevant and good chemical, you remove the content from the check, and then you use the check. You have a blank check. You can write whatever you want on it, whatever amount and whatever payee name, and then you simply go and cash it. Now, it still happens to an extent, but the criminals are cooking checks, meaning they take the information from the checks. They have different supplies that allow them to print new checks. They take the information from the checks along with the target signatures, and they simply print perfect checks. So to detect these kind of stolen or fraudulent checks, it really is a challenge, and this is the major challenge financial institutions are experiencing with. I'm not familiar with a very good detection tool at this point, right? I mean, I know folks are working on it, but I think the challenge is being out there, as I mentioned earlier, collecting relevant information and then feeding your tool with relevant information from the ecosystem, which will in turn help improve detection. That is something that I know there are a couple of startups right now working on, but I haven't really seen an effective tool I can say, yeah, I mean, folks, you should use this or that in the context of check fraud.
And I think, this is a webinar series and not a sales series, but Mitek, really is collaborating not only with you, but very sophisticated data science and innovation within our four walls to take this on. And, having our history in checks, the amount of data that we've got enables us to do that. And we've just applying it as quickly as we can with some really solid results. But as you say, it's constantly evolving. Started with washing, continues to be washed because that's what they'll use wherever they can, but they also continue to use data science and intelligence, whether it's artificial intelligence or manual intelligence to really get the best of the best. So, we're here to help, but it's super important that we do come together. Tell me a little bit about, it's tax season coming up. There's also an imminent recession on the cusp. Do you think people are going to use more and more checks, and check fraud is just going to get more and more sophisticated? Hate tax season because I don't want people necessarily to get reimbursed that way, but it's scary. It's a scary time of the year to have checks around. Any comment on that?
So the relationship between recession and fraud, I mean, many scholars try to sort of come up with, scientific ways to measure that. I mean, there are many challenges right there. So, I'm and the evidence is kind of all over the place. So, some evidence suggests that, yeah, there is strong relationship between recession and fraud. Other studies suggest that there's really no such relationship. And I think there are several challenges that we need to address in the context of fraud, right? First, when we talk about fraud and we try to establish a relationship between a phenomenon, like maybe recession or war or whatever, right? And the amount of fraud we have in our society, there's a huge challenge of talking of operationalizing or quantifying fraud. I mean, first of all, what is it that you mean? And even if you tell me what is it that you mean, are you talking about the overall fraud we have or just the fraud you're able to detect, right? And those periods maybe are also a period when you're either better at detecting fraud or less capable, right, of detecting fraud, and also how the ecosystem sort of respond to it and so on. So the evidence is kind of problematic for me to sort of draw on when I sort of hypothesize, right, about the relationship between recession and check fraud. I mean, I can form a hypothesis, but it could be based on my experience and other folks here. Yeah, other folks here have maybe more experience. I think in the context of recession, we know that those type of frauds that are more likely to emerge are those frauds where folks need to spend less money on. In other words, there's less money, so it's more complicated to get people to invest in all kind of opportunities, like fraudulent opportunities and so forth. So I think that in the context of recession, now that we know that we're talking in the context of check fraud, we're talking about illicit supply chain and organized crime groups who work on this issue. I think if we hit a recession, it'll be easier for those organized crime groups to recruit folks at the end of the supply chain who will help them go and cash the checks, open the drop bank accounts using their faces, simply because money is tight and there's not a lot of an investment that is required from those end users, so to speaking, right? I mean, the people at the end of the supply chain. So I believe, I hypothesize that potentially we can see this increase simply because in time of a recession, there's less money. People are looking for opportunities to make some money, and if you don't have to invest too much money in a specific activity, and you can potentially bring money home with a low level of risk, then yeah, I mean, that type of fraud potentially may increase.
Scary.
So that is my guess, but there's no
Yeah,
scientific research that ties between these two phenomena.
I agree, and thank you for sharing your insights. And I recognize that it's your point of view relative to supported by research, but because of our ability to communicate on multiple channels, it gives the fraudsters wider canvas to solicit folks. Hey, earn $10,000 from your home without too much effort. And I'm assuming a ton of folks don't realize that they're actually being recruited by fraudsters. So super scary and a very difficult time for many. Before I go on and ask some more of my questions, I'm just encouraging the folks on the webinar to use the feature on your tool, the chat feature, to type in any messages that you may want me to ask David as we continue this fascinating discussion. I guess on that concept, a lot of folks are going to want to get your opinion on guidance. How can banks be better prepared for fraud? What are some of the best practices that you see in today's time? We spoke a little bit about consistency and intentional, but give us a little bit of advice on how you could advise banks to best prepare.
It's a great question. I think being more proactive is the most important thing banks should do. And by being more proactive, I mean several things, right? I mean, I think there's definitely a need for financial institutions to spend more time, the employees, right, or their partners, their consultants, or financial or academic institutions. The banks are working with, make sure that folks are out there in the ecosystem and collect data in a systematic manner in order to really try and understand how the ecosystem evolves. One of the things that we know about fraud is that it simply doesn't stay the same more than a short period of time. It constantly evolves. I remember one of the studies that we ran a couple of years ago. We focused on business email compromise. And we're working with this company, a startup company, and it was a fascinating research, because what we've done was we were able to get access to the fraudsters' inboxes. Right? I mean, don't ask me how we did that, but what we were able to get access and see with our own eyes the fraudsters' conversations with each other, the fraudsters developing new types of fraud, and the fraudster targeting specific institutions, to the point where we actually saw payments coming into the inboxes, and of course we alerted the financial institutions we've seen money was taken from, right? And to me, I mean, there's a lot going on in that research, and I loved it, right? But to me, the most important lesson was that fraudsters are constantly working on new types of fraud. I mean, you see how they continue to just talk about new type of scams that they can develop and new types of targets that they can get some money from. You see that in the conversations they're having with each other. You see that in the different types of scams they develop on a weekly basis. And to me, the major lesson was that just You have to be there with them if you want to be a step behind them, right? Not five. You just need to be along with them. You need to continue to understand what is it that they're working on. And that is, to me, proactive. I mean, starting to detect things is key, right? But you detect things after they happen. If you're more proactive, if you understand what folks are working on, you're in a better position to potentially inject some kind of an intervention that will prevent the fraudsters from succeeding in their fraudulent operation. So being out there, I think, and explore is key, in my opinion. And if you think about it in the context of cybersecurity, folks talk a lot about threat intelligence. This is pretty much what it is, right? I mean, simply being out there, collecting information about groups who form and work on ransomware, or any type of malicious software targeting specific or contemplating to target specific organization. This is essentially what it's all about. So I think that's key. I think another very important thing that financial institution needs to do is adjust the onboarding time, so to speaking, because we all know that it takes time to onboard a new company, right, or a new partner, and sometimes by the time you onboard a new solution, that solution is no longer relevant, right? Because folks are no longer doing this, right? I mean, so I think something needs to be said about the really long period of time it takes to onboard new companies or new technology, new innovation. And then the last thing, I think, evidence-based, right? I mean, we wanna work with tools. You want to embrace policies that at the end of the day actually works, especially in times of, if we're going, God forbid, to a recession. I mean, we're going to be tight in money. Folks don't want to invest money all over the place because, we're tight on money. We need to make sure that we invest money in solutions which we know work, right? So, collect evidence about what works and what doesn't, and simply spend time and effort and money on solution which works. That is, to me, the approach financial institutions need to take at this time.
Thank you. Those are three really important insights. Super helpful, super actionable, common thread between all of them. And sometimes I say, once you're working in this industry, it kind of hooks you in because you're on the good side, on the right side of good. But there's a common thread between all of that, and it's about sharing, whether it's the evidence, whether it's the technique, whether it's the onboarding best practice, whether it's the different types of fraud that we're responding to. But in this ecosystem concept again, something like a consortium where we are able to share the bad news faster, right? Being able to share amongst one another, even though we compete. Maybe it's bank A versus bank B, or CDF, or whatever the case may be, but we're able to share. Do you have a point of view on ecosystem or consortiums relative to helping fight this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's key to share, right? It's key to share because without us sharing information, the criminals will just win away, because criminals do work together. They constantly share. Granted, sometimes they will charge you money for sharing information. We know that many criminals actually run tutorials, right, on how to engage in different types of crime. But at the end of the day, they do share. We need to be, in my mind, better position to share data between the banks. I know it's a challenge. I mean, I've been talking about this a lot during the last 2 years or so, but there are legal challenges there that I know exist. The legal teams in financial institutions, and even in organizations that they're not necessarily, are fintech, right? I mean, it's very difficult to allow information sharing because, folks are worried, right, about their clients' information. So I know there are solutions that folks are working on right now in order to build those consortiums which will allow data sharing without having the risk of, PIIs leaking or anything of that sort. that is definitely the place we should be going. So just to make sure, financial institutions do share a lot in terms of knowledge, in terms of trends that they see on their infrastructures. What they don't share, though, and that is to me is an issue, is victimization in terms of clients, in terms of the businesses they do that they work with, and that is to me an extremely valuable information to share, right? Because if, for example, I know that bank A customer checks has been stolen, it's just a matter of time, based on what we see, that this identity will be used to open another bank account in a different bank, in bank B. So if we share this information, I think banks will be in a better position to address a wider range of fraudulent activities that the criminals are trying to initiate against them.
Absolutely. And use it wisely. Share, encrypt it, do whatever we need to do to leverage that data in the right ways.
Yeah.
David, we have a question from Sarah in our audience today. She's asking, can you please reveal some platforms and specific channels where you're observing the most fraud?
So we're on platforms such as Telegram, such as ICQ, such as WhatsApp. We also spend a lot of time on the darknet, even though the darknet is not as active as it used to be. We have some presence on Russian platforms, but the focus there is geared more towards cybersecurity relevant issues. So we try to understand the formation of ransomware groups and other types of criminal activities that some Russian actors are working on. So, but these are the platforms we use. Of course, we have presence on Discord and other platforms, right? I mean, we simply try to follow the criminals. So.
I saw recently one of the articles that you spoke about was the rise of fraud on the Cash App. Tell us a little bit about that and why certain channels much more aggressively than some of the other competitors, like Zelle, for instance, in that case.
So the criminal will work with whatever channels that is most convenient and allow them to keep their anonymity on it. Cash App is one of those platforms we've seen for quite a while now being used by the criminals. So when we started around 2019. It was always between Bitcoin, which is a cryptocurrency, right, and Cash App, right? But then at some point, folks decided to. I mean, they still work with Bitcoin, but we see more and more Cash App now. Simply because, again, it's convenience, it's cash, right, that you can get fairly easily, and so we see that we see folks using this platform a lot. It's easy, as I said earlier. It's convenient. It provides you with the level of anonymity that folks feel comfortable with. So they are using it. Now, I think there's that Zelle. I mean, there are other platforms, PayPal, and PayPal is also another platform that the criminals really like using. There's some level of scrutiny there as well, and I think that what at the end of the day plays a very important role. I would say that when we started doing this, when folks really preferred using Bitcoin, there was less scrutiny about the identity of the Bitcoin wallet holder. So folks were all there, and back then it was also folks were using a lot of fake identities in order to establish those those wallets. Now it's more complicated. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but it's more complicated to do that. Plus, folks realize that Bitcoin transactions could be tracked. So they're moving to other platforms which will allow them to withdraw money fast and do it anonymously.
Yeah, so we've got an influx of questions coming, so I want to make sure that I'm interactive with the audience as best I can. So I'm going to shoot them at you in rapid fire, if you don't mind. So firstly, a question really just to iterate off what we've just heard there around, can you share some of the visual examples of the fraud you are discussing?
Can I share what exactly?
Some visual examples of the fraud you're discussing. So probably some real life examples of the fraud you're discussing.
So if folks want me to share my screen, it'll be a little problematic at this point, right? I can't really share my screen.
No, I don't think unless if they wanted to, but just even if you could point them in a right direction where they can find some of your writing or something where they could see it.
So yeah, and LinkedIn is one of those platforms we use a lot in order to just show people what is it that we see. And I have to be frank, I believe in being completely transparent, right, with respect to explaining how we know what we know. And so we really post a lot on social media. We take advantage of opportunities like this one to sometimes even show some of the intelligence that we collect and some of the data that we work with. I think if you're looking for visuals, LinkedIn is definitely one of the platforms we constantly use in order to show what we see.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can you talk to some of the 4 steps behind and how it is tied to old technology at banks versus the new technology used by fraudsters?
So we know, and we can talk about it in the context of government, we can talk about it in the context of the financial industry. I mean, there's a common misconception among the government, right? That the financial industry is always, I mean, they're doing better, right, in terms of fraud. I don't think it's correct. Maybe it could be, but I don't have an empirical evidence to actually support that claim, right? What I am seeing, and especially during, and I will talking about the last 3 years, right? What I am seeing is that more and more criminals are constantly working on ways to bypass security tools that the financial industry is deploying out there. I think one of the example I can speak a lot about is 2FA, right? 2FA and MFA, right? I mean, two-factor authentication, right? I mean, we already know that the criminals know how to bypass two-factor authentication, but yet we still see financial institution deploying this type of technology, right? And so my question is why? I mean, I understand that sometimes you do that for the legal team, right? I mean, and just to make sure that you're in compliance. But we know that the criminals have already found way to bypass the two-factor authentication. Now, we do a lot of work in the context of compromised bank accounts. So compromised bank accounts, victims simply are lured to provide password and username. Many banks have multi-factor authentication procedure, which at the end of the day allows them to detect traffic from unknown devices. But we know that the criminals now found a way to simply embed malicious software on the victims' computers and then simply contact and take over an account from the victim's own computer using remote desktop processing, right? I mean, but we still see folks deploying MFA, right? I mean, so to me, that's an indication that we're several steps behind. We're not one step behind, right? We're several steps behind because, I still see financial institutions finding, the new tool, right, that will help them reduce fraud, and sometimes it does, but unfortunately, it does for a short period of time, after which we see, things go back to be like they used to be in the past. And again, we actually ran some research in the context of 2FA, trying to figure out how the implementation of 2FA by financial institutions in Canada impacted the volume of compromised bank accounts we find on the ecosystem of those banks, and we find that sometimes the implementation of 2FA works sometimes it doesn't, but even if it does work, we see that things go back to be where they were, I would say between 6 and 8 months after the implementation of a tool. And that is why I'm saying that I think financial institutions are, and the government as well, I mean, are 5 steps behind.
Super insightful. And I think, again, accountability on us in this ecosystem to educate our consumer or our customers, our users, on the risks of some of the dated technology or the dated formats. We about 2 years ago, we did a fraud research with Javelin, and it revealed that consumers trust their banks more than the government. They trust their banks more than anyone else. And so banks are really in a position of authority to guide and educate. And I know that many of the fraud leaders within these banking institutions feel responsibility for their consumers. Let's bind together to help them, right?
Yeah, and I think training is definitely part of the solution, right? I mean, training is definitely part of the solution, but the way we're doing even training nowadays is problematic, right? And we actually conducted a lot of research as well around this issue, because think about it. I mean, in the context of training, we usually have a one-size-fits-all training sessions, right? But at the end of the day, we know that different people have different cognitive abilities, right? I mean, so in one of the experiments we ran, what we've done was we tried to train a group of people about the hazard of cyberspace, right? So we were doing that with text we sent to them maybe once or twice a week, and then we sent a phishing attack, right? To just see whether they were able to observe everything we're talking about. You know, don't go there, don't click links, whatever, right? So we ran experiments. We had a control group where we just control their phones. We just looked at what they will do after we send them the phishing text, and then we had the group where we actually send those training messages, right? Before the experiment, we actually administered a survey trying to figure out their cognitive processes. And what we found was that the training session, the awareness or training, whatever you want to call it, session worked for people with high cognitive abilities. So for them, we definitely see a reduction in the probability of clicking on the phishing email. But for folks with low cognitive abilities, the training actually confused them. So we saw that they were more likely to click on the phishing link than if we wouldn't have given them any training, right? So again, I mean, how you know what you know, right, is really important, right? I mean, so training is key, right? But should we engage in one-size-fits-all training? I don't think so, because at the end of the day, it could expose your organization to attacks as well. So.
Yeah, it's kind of like the text message that you get that says your bank will never contact you.
Yeah.
But somebody's going to click on the text message to say the bank never contacts you, right?
Yeah.
So it is really tough in terms of being responsible for consumer behavior and protecting them as best we can. David, we're coming up to the end of our webinar. There's a couple more questions that were submitted. So to the folks that are on the line and wanted their questions answered, we will put it in a FAQ. David or the team here at Mitek will be able to respond to some of those, and the recording along with an FAQ will be shared with attendees on today's webinar. So we're going to go out with one question that came in from a attendee. How do you think banks could protect themselves more by using technology? So this is more for the bank protecting themselves from the technology.
So banks protecting themselves from what kind of?
What technology can banks? This is the way I understand it. How do you think banks could protect themselves more by way of technology? So what technology could they deploy to protect themselves against fraud?
Right. I mean, I'm not familiar with all the technology which is out there. So unfortunately, I won't be able to speak into that. The only thing I will speak to is evidence-based, right? I mean, so from our work in cybersecurity, we know of many tools which the industry produces on a monthly basis, and if you go to RSA, you'll be able to get all those vendors in one place. Everybody will sell you, right? I mean, but at the end of the day, we know that many of those tools, do not really work, right? I mean, that's the thing with cybersecurity, and in my opinion, also in the context of online fraud. Again, based on what I know, and it could be completely wrong, but I think it's a market for lemon, so to speaking, right? Where the vendor, the seller, know most about the product than the buyer, right? And that creates a market where the buyers, because they don't know how effective the tool is, they're not willing to pay the same price. I mean, high prices, right, on the different tools, right? To me, to address this issue of market for lemon, what needs to happen is that we need to have more evidence with respect to the effectiveness of tools and how effective those tools in detecting fraud in the wild. I'm not familiar with any consortium or any scientific group who try to answer these kind of questions. We are, but there's a lot of resources that needs to get into this in order to really build this, I don't know, ISO or any kind of organization that could validate the effectiveness of a tool, right? In terms of money, in terms of manpower, in terms of making sure that you're not being biased. I think that banks, if we talked about sharing, should build a consortium that will allow them at the end of the day to answer this question of what works and what doesn't in the context of fraud, right? I mean, a standalone organization, consortium, which has no biases, all banks sort of feed in whatever amount of money that they deem appropriate in order for the organization to really test what works and what doesn't in the context of fraud. I mean, that unfortunately is the best answer I can give to this question.
Wonderful, and I concur. We are all in this ecosystem. We are all on the right side of good, and the more we can leverage with one another, the better. And working with technology partners that really get it, that really get your pain for the bank that's trying to defend against fraud and protect their customers. So I really do appreciate you joining us today, Dr. David Maimon. Thank you so much. We are, we look forward to hosting you at another point in time. For the folks joining our Checked Summit series, very excited to have you join us. Please look out for more news, and we look forward to engaging and sharing the details and the questions answered from David here today. So with that, I'm going to call it, and thank you very much again, David, and everybody else. Have a lovely day. Thank you so much.
For having me.